The year was 1889, and the sun did not merely shine upon the Arizona territory. It struck it with the heavy hand of a blacksmith shaping iron. Red Mesa Crossing sat baking in the center of this anvil, a collection of timber and adobe caught between the unforgiving red cliffs of the high desert and the relentless, iron-willed expansion of the railroad. The air tasted of alkali dust, pine resin, and the metallic tang of dried blood, sometimes from cattle, sometimes from men. It was a place where the earth was split by canyons and the society was split by hatred. The United States Army maintained a nervous watch from the fort on the ridge. The Navajo people, the Dene, watched back from the shadows of the mesas, their ancestral lands shrinking with every mile of steel track laid down by the railroad company. Between them moved the opportunists, the white merchants, the hired guns, the cattlemen, and the desperate souls looking for a new start. Joanna Mercer was one of the desperate ones, though she would never admit it aloud. Inside the kitchen of the Traveler's Rest, the air was thick enough to chew. It smelled of yeast, roasting venison, and the heavy, sweet scent of molasses. Joanna, known to everyone simply as Jo, drove her fists into a mound of dough on the floured work table. She worked with a rhythm that was both punishing and graceful. She was a woman of significant substance. Her shoulders were broad and capable. Her hips flared wide against the fabric of her gingham dress, and her arms, currently dusted with white flour, were round and heavy. In Kansas, they had called her Big Jo. In the schoolyard, they had called her the Barn. Here, in the raw wilderness of the West, she had hoped to leave the names behind, but the mirror told her the truth every morning. At 26 years of age, she occupied more space than the world seemed willing to grant a woman. "Joanna, dear, do try not to sweat so much." Her Aunt May fluttered into the kitchen, fanning herself with a folded newspaper. May was a bird of a woman, sharp-boned and withered by widowhood, but possessing a tireless energy for criticism. "It is unseemly for the guests to see the cook dripping like a racehorse. It is 100 degrees in the shade. Aunt May," Jo said, her voice a low, steady alto that contrasted with her aunt's chirp. "And the stove is running hot. Well, if you would just cinch that corset a little tighter, you would not feel so lethargic," May tutted, reaching out to pinch the fabric at Jo's waist. "Mr. Ethan Doyle arrives tomorrow. Does he not? You want to look presentable? A man like Mr. Doyle, a man of letters, he will appreciate a woman who takes care of her figure." Jo stiffened, the joy of the kneading motion vanishing. Ethan Doyle. The name sat in her chest like a fluttering moth. They had exchanged letters for 6 months, introduced by a mutual acquaintance in Topeka. Ethan was a clerk at the general store, a man who wrote with elegant loops and swirls. In her last letter, she had confessed her size. Terrified he would stop writing, he had replied, "A woman should have substance. I prefer a home-cooked meal to a starving bird. I look forward to your cooking." "I will be presentable," Jo said, turning back to the dough to hide the flush rising in her cheeks. "I am making the venison stew," he said he liked. "Just mind your portions, dear," May said, patting Jo's ample arm with a pitying look. "We have to make the supplies last, and you know how hearty your appetite can be." The comment was a small needle, but it found an old groove in Jo's heart. She said nothing. She let the rhythm of the work consume her. Knead, turn, push, knead, turn, push. If she worked hard enough, perhaps she could sweat away the shame. Out on the boardwalk, the evening brought no relief from the heat, only a change in the quality of the light. The red rocks turned the color of bruised plums as the sun dipped below the horizon. Silas Crowley stood on the porch of the saloon, a lit cigar clamped between his teeth. He was a man who looked as though he had been carved from the very sandstone of the canyon, hard, abrasive, and utterly devoid of softness. He wore a suit that cost more than most men in Red Mesa earned in a year, dust-free and sharply tailored. As the owner of the Double C Ranch and the primary subcontractor for the railroad grading, Crowley essentially owned the town. He watched the street with eyes like flint. A group of Navajo women were walking near the edge of town, selling woven blankets. Crowley's lip curled. "Sheriff," Crowley said without turning his head. Sheriff Tom Cutler, a man whose spine had eroded along with his morals, stepped out of the shadows. Mr. Crowley. "Those Indians are getting too close to the grading site again," Crowley said, his voice a low rumble. "My men can't work with savages breathing down their necks, and the investors coming next month. They want to see civilization. Cutler, not a reservation. They ain't breaking any laws." "Silas," Cutler mumbled. "Treaty says they can trade." "Treaties are paper," Crowley snapped, flicking ash onto the wooden boards. "Progress is iron. I received a report that another supply wagon was raided 3 miles east. Arrows in the sideboards. Driver dead." Cutler frowned. "Navajo?" "Who else?" Crowley smiled, a cold expression that did not reach his eyes. "Tell the colonel at the fort. Tell him the savages are getting restless. If the army won't clear them out, I will have to hire more consultants to protect my interests." Crowley knew perfectly well that no Navajo war party had raided that wagon. He knew because he had paid the men who did it. He had paid them $20 a head to paint their faces and wear buckskins. Fear was a tool, just like a hammer or a rifle. If he could make the town terrified of the Navajo, he could take the water rights in the canyon for his cattle and the railroad. He looked back toward the new eatery, seeing the large silhouette of Joe Mercer moving past the window. He scoffed. "And tell that fat woman to keep her slops out of the alley. I don't want rats in my town. God, look at her. A sow in a dress." Dinner service at the Traveler's Rest was chaotic. The railroad workers and cattle drovers ate with the ferocity of wolves. Joe moved between the tables, carrying trays that would have strained a lesser woman. She navigated the crowded room with practiced efficiency, but she felt every eye on her. In Kansas, she had been invisible. Here, where women were scarce, she was hyper-visible, but not in the way she craved. She was a curiosity, a spectacle. She set a steaming bowl of stew down in front of a table of 3 cattle hands from Crowley's ranch. They were dusty, smelling of horse sweat and whiskey. "Here you are," Joe said softly. "Fresh bread will be out in a minute." As she turned to leave, one of the men, a wiry fellow with a missing front tooth, leaned toward his companion. He did not lower his voice enough. "Good Lord," the man snickered. "Look at the size of that heifer. I bet she eats 3 plates for every one she serves." "Careful, Jeb," the second man laughed, swiping a piece of bread through his gravy. "She might hear you and sit on you, crush you flat like a tick. I reckon that is why the prices are so high here," the third man added. "Got to pay for the cook's feed bill." The laughter was sharp and jagged. It raked across Joe's back like briars. She did not stop walking. She did not spill a drop of the water pitcher she was carrying. She walked straight into the kitchen, placed the pitcher on the counter, and gripped the edge of the wood until her knuckles turned white. "Do not cry," she commanded herself. "You are 26 years old. You are a business owner. You are strong, but the strength felt physical, heavy, and burdensome. It was not the delicate, fainting strength of the heroines in the novels she read. It was the strength of a draft horse, valued only for its labor, never for its beauty. Late that night, when the last dish was washed and Aunt May was snoring softly in the back room, Joe slipped out the back door. The air had finally cooled, dropping to a tolerable 70 degrees. The sky was a vast, inverted bowl of obsidian, pierced by a million stars that seemed close enough to touch. She carried a bucket to the well at the edge of the property, near where the town gave way to the open sagebrush. The silence here was profound, a stark contrast to the clatter of the dining room. Joe set the bucket down on the stone rim of the well. She looked at her hands in the moonlight. They were red from scrubbing, the fingers thick and capable. She touched her own waist, feeling the soft roll of flesh beneath the cotton nightgown she had thrown a shawl over. The tears she had held back earlier finally came. They were hot and silent, sliding down her cheeks. She hated her hunger, not just the hunger for food, which she denied herself constantly, but the hunger for tenderness, the hunger to be held, the hunger to be seen as something other than a joke. "Ethan comes tomorrow," she thought desperately. He will be different. He wrote the letters. He knows me. A sound in the brush made her freeze. It was not the scuttling of a lizard or the call of a coyote. It was the soft, rhythmic crunch of weight on sand. Jo wiped her face hastily with her shawl and stepped back into the shadow of the roof overhang. From the darkness of the open desert, 3 figures emerged. They moved like ghosts, their steps silent. They were Navajo. The man in the lead stopped 10 yards from the well. It was Nez Greyhawk. Jo had heard of him. The town gossips called him a troublemaker, a savage, a remnant of a war that should have ended years ago. They said he had killed soldiers. They said he hated white men. He was tall, with a lean, roped muscularity that spoke of a life lived in the saddle and on the rocks. His hair was black as Aravan's wing, pulled back and tied with a simple leather cord. He wore a mixture of traditional buckskin and white man's trousers, a rifle slung easily over one shoulder. He was not looking at the town with hatred. He was looking at it with a profound, weary vigilance. He was watching the saloon, the livery stable, the darkened windows of Crowley's office. Then, he turned his head and saw her. Jo stopped breathing. She was standing in the moonlight now, her shawl slipping from her shoulder, revealing the fullness of her arm and the curve of her bodice. She felt exposed, gigantic, a white blot on the dark landscape. She waited for the sneer. She waited for the look of disgust she saw on the faces of the cowboys. Nez did not sneer. He stood perfectly still, his dark eyes locking onto hers across the distance. His face was a map of the country angles of cheekbone like cliff edges, skin the color of sandstone. There was a scar running from his left ear down to his collarbone, a pale line on dark skin. He looked at her face. Then, his gaze traveled down to her shoulders, her waist, and back up to her eyes. It was a frank assessment, but it lacked the predatory lewdness of the men in the saloon. It lacked the mockery of the cattle hands. It was a look of recognition. He saw a human being standing in the dark, in pain. For 10 seconds, neither of them moved. The wind whispered through the sagebrush. Jo felt a strange heat rise in her chest, different from the shame. It was a sudden, intense awareness of her own gravity. Nez nodded once, a microscopic dip of his chin, acknowledging her presence, and then turned. He melted back into the darkness with his companions, as if he had never been there. Jo stood at the well for a long time, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. He had seen her, he had seen all of her, and he had not laughed. The next morning, the sun rose with a vengeance, but Jo hummed as she worked. Today was the day. She dressed with agonizing care. She pulled the laces of her corset until she could barely draw a full breath, smoothing her best blue dress over her hips. She pinned her hair up, letting a few carefully curled tendrils escape to frame her face. "Is that him?" Aunt May hissed from the front window around 10 o'clock. Jo wiped her hands on her apron and rushed to look. A man was walking down the dusty street toward the Traveler's Rest. He wore a bowler hat and a checked suit that seemed a little too tight in the shoulders. It was Ethan Doyle. Jo's heart leaped. He looked exactly as she had imagined, slender, with a neat mustache and a pleasant, open face. He walked with a bounce in his step. She met him on the porch. The air was already shimmering with heat. "Mr. Doyle," she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He stopped and tipped his hat. His eyes scanned her, and for a fraction of a second, Jo saw a flicker of something surprise. Disappointment. It happened so fast she convinced herself she had imagined it. "Miss Mercer." Ethan smiled, and the smile was dazzling. "Joanna, my goodness, it is a pleasure to finally put a face to the letters." "The pleasure is mine, Ethan," she said, daring to use his first name. "Please, come inside. I have prepared lunch." The lunch went well. On the surface, Ethan ate the venison stew with gusto. He complimented the seasoning. He told stories about the journey from Kansas City, about the characters he had met on the train. He was charming. He was polite. But he did not look at her the way he looked at his food. He looked past her. He looked at the room. He looked at Aunt May. When he looked at Jo, his eyes glazed over. sliding off her as if finding purchase on her form was difficult. "The food is exquisite. Joanna," he said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "Truly, you have a gift." "I made it just for you," she said, her hope making her bold. "You said in your letter." Yes, he interrupted gently. Standing up, "I must say, Red Mesa is quite the bustling metropolis. I have some business to attend to at the general store. I am starting my position today, but I wanted to pay my respects first. Will I see you at the dance tonight?" Joe asked. The town was holding a social at the community hall to welcome the railroad engineers. "Oh, certainly," Ethan said, backing toward the door. "I would not miss it." He left, leaving a trail of bay rum cologne in the air. Joe felt a mixture of relief and unease. He had been nice. He had been a gentleman. But where was the warmth from the letters? "He is just shy," she told herself. "He is overwhelmed by the new town." Joe cleaned up the table, her mind spinning with dreams of the evening. She needed to buy more flour from the general store for the morning baking. It would be a good excuse to see him again, perhaps catch him in a more candid moment. She grabbed her bonnet and walked down the boardwalk toward the store. The sun was at its zenith, bleaching the color out of the world. As she approached the general store, she saw Ethan standing on the loading dock. He was surrounded by 3 other men, local clerks, and a couple of the idlers who spent their days whittling and spitting tobacco. Joe slowed her steps, wanting to surprise him. She stepped quietly into the shade of the store's awning. So that is her?" one of the men asked, laughing. "The Kansas girl you were writing to." Joe froze. "That is her." Ethan's voice drifted around the corner. It sounded different now. The politeness was gone, replaced by a locker room swagger. "She is a big one. Doyle." Another man guffawed. "You going to need a longer ladder to climb that mountain?" Joe's breath hitched in her throat. She pressed herself against the rough wood of the wall, unable to move. "Defend me," she prayed. "Defend me." "Ethan, she is healthy," Ethan said, and Joe could hear the smirk in his voice. "Look, boys, the letters were entertaining, and she can cook like an angel. A man has to eat." "But are you going to court her?" the first man pressed. "Walk her out," Ethan laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that shattered Joe's world into 1,000 jagged pieces. "Let us be reasonable," Ethan said. "She is a sweet girl, very kind. But honestly, she is a bit too much to hold, if you catch my meaning. I mean, imagine trying to get your arms around that in the dark. You would get lost." The men roared with laughter. "I will keep her friendly," Ethan continued, his voice lowering conspiratorially. "A man needs a good meal now and then. But for a wife, I need something I can show off in church, not something that takes up the whole pew." Joe did not wait to hear more. The blood drained from her face, leaving her cold despite the 100-degree heat. The sensation was physical, a punch to the gut that knocked the wind out of her. The letters, the promises, "I prefer substance," all lies. He was just like the rest of them. He saw her as a utility, a cook, a warm body to mock, but not a woman. Never a woman. She turned and walked back toward the inn. She did not run. Running would attract attention, and she was done being a spectacle. She walked with a terrible, rigid dignity, her chin held high while tears burned hot tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Behind her, the laughter of the men faded, but the echo of it remained, bouncing off the red cliffs, louder than the train whistle, louder than the wind. Too much, she thought, the words carving themselves into her mind. Too much to hold. Tonight was the dance. Aunt May would expect her to go. Ethan would expect her to be there, smiling and grateful for his crumbs of attention. Joe wiped her face with the back of her hand. Her eyes were dry now, hardening into something brittle. She would go to the dance, but she would not be the fool he thought she was. And deep down, a dangerous thought began to take root if the town thought she was nothing but a joke. Perhaps she had nothing left to lose. High above on the ridge, unseen by Joe or the laughing men, a figure watched the town through a spyglass, Nez Greyhawk lowered the glass. He had seen the woman stop. He had seen her slump against the wall, and he had seen her walk away with the stiffness of the wounded. He did not know what was said, but he knew the body language of pain. He turned his horse away from the town, riding back toward the hogan where his grandmother waited. The air smelled of ozone. A storm was coming. Not just rain, but something that would scour the dust from Red Mesa Crossing and reveal the bones beneath. The community hall was festooned with paper lanterns that swayed gently in the draft, casting long, dancing shadows against the rough-hewn timber walls. The air inside was stifling, a thick soup of tobacco smoke, cheap perfume, and the sweat of 50 people crammed into a space meant for 30. A fiddle and a beat-up piano churned out a lively reel, the music vibrating through the floorboards. For Joanna Mercer, the evening was a specific kind of torture. Earlier, in the privacy of her room, Aunt May had cinched Joe's corset so tight that breathing had become a conscious, labored effort. Beauty is pain. "Joanna," May had chirped, bracing her foot against the bed frame to pull the laces tighter. "And a husband is worth a little breathlessness." Now, standing near the punch bowl in her best blue silk dress, Joe felt like a trussed turkey. The whalebone stays dug into her ribs, and the fabric strained across her chest and hips. She held a glass of tepid lemonade, her eyes scanning the room for Ethan Doyle. She found him near the bandstand. He looked dashing, she had to admit, with his hair slicked back and his collar starched stiff. He was laughing with a group of railroad surveyors and cattlemen. Joe took a deep breath, or as deep as the corset would allow, and smoothed her skirts. Ethan had promised. He had written in his last letter, "I shall claim the first dance, and we shall show this town what elegance looks like." The music wound down, and the fiddle player tapped his bow against the stand. "All right, folks," he hollered. "Grab your partners for a slow waltz, gentlemen. Make your move." Joe's heart hammered against her ribs. She saw Ethan turn. His eyes swept the room and landed on her. For a moment, she saw him hesitate. She took a tentative step forward, a shy smile touching her lips. Ethan started to walk toward her. "Hey, Doyle," a booming voice cut through the chatter. It belonged to Jeb, the same toothless cattle hand who had mocked her at the diner. He was leaning against a pillar, a bottle of whiskey dangling from his hand. "You aiming to dance with the whole territory at once?" The room went quiet. The fiddler paused. Jeb grinned, his eyes wet and malicious. "Better brace yourself, son. Watch your back don't snap under the strain. That is a lot of lady to steer around a turn." Ethan froze. He was 5 steps away from Joe. The smile on Joe's face faltered, then died. She looked at Ethan, pleading silently. "Defend me. Just take my hand. Show them." Ethan looked at Jeb, then at the snickering men around him. His face flushed a deep crimson. The courage Joe had hoped for, the depth she had read in his letters, evaporated like water on a hot skillet. He turned back to Joe. He did not step closer. He cleared his throat. "Joanna," he said, his voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, I find myself suddenly quite fatigued. The heat in here is oppressive. Perhaps we should dance another time." Before Joe could process the rejection, Ethan turned on his heel. "Miss Clara," he said, extending a hand to the blacksmith's daughter, a girl as thin as a willow branch standing nearby. "Would you do me the honor before I faint from this heat?" Clara giggled and took his hand. As they swept onto the floor, the room exhaled. The tension broke into scattered, cruel laughter. "Smart man," someone whispered loudly. Joe stood alone by the punch bowl. The music started up again, a lilting waltz that mocked the roaring in her ears. Her face burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature. She felt enormous. She felt as if she took up the entire room, as if her very existence was an imposition on the town's happiness. She set the lemonade glass down on the table. Her hand was trembling so violently, the glass clattered against the bowl. She did not run. A woman of her size running would only be another joke. She turned and walked to the door, chin held high, eyes fixed on the darkness outside. She navigated the crowd, feeling their eyes sliding over her back, judging the width of her hips, the flesh of her arms. As soon as the heavy oak doors closed behind her, the noise of the party muffled to a dull thrum. Joe gasped, leaning against the rough exterior wall, fighting the urge to vomit. "Fat Joe," she whispered to the night. "Big girl, too much." She could not go back to the inn. Aunt May would be there soon, asking why she wasn't dancing, asking what she had done wrong. Joe needed to be gone. She needed to be anywhere but here. She hurried to the small stable behind the inn. Her movements were frantic now. She began to hitch the old mare, Bessie, to the small supply wagon. "We are going for a ride. Bessie," Joe murmured, her voice thick with unshed tears. "We have to take the bread to the fort. Yes, tonight. It is cooler tonight." It was a lie she told herself to justify the flight. The delivery was not due until the next afternoon, but the fort was 5 miles away. It was quiet. It was away from Ethan Doyle and his hollow promises. She climbed onto the wagon seat, the wood groaning slightly under her weight, a sound that made her wince and snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, leaving Red Mesa Crossing behind. The desert at night was a vast ocean of silence. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, offering little light. Joe drove the wagon along the rutted track that wound through the canyon leading toward the military outpost. The cool air dried the sweat on her face, but the shame still burned in her chest. She replayed the scene over and over. Ethan's hesitation, the laughter, the way he had looked at Clara as if she were a prize, and Joe was a burden. She was so lost in her misery that she did not notice the silence of the night had changed. The crickets had stopped chirping. The road dipped into a narrow defile, a place called Shadow Gorge, where the red rock walls rose sheer on either side, blocking out the stars. Suddenly, a high-pitched, ululating shriek tore through the air. Joe screamed and pulled back on the reins. Bessie reared, whinnying in terror. From the shadows of the rocks, 4 figures emerged on horseback. They were terrifying silhouettes, bare-chested despite the chill, feathers tied into their hair. Their faces were painted with jagged stripes of black and red. "Stop!" One of them roared. Joe froze. Indians. A raiding party. The very thing the townspeople whispered about in terrified tones. "Get down!" the leader shouted. He rode closer, brandishing a rifle. "Get down, fat woman!" Joe scrambled backward on the seat, her heart hammering so hard she thought it would burst. But something was wrong. The man's voice, it was rough and guttural. But the words were English, clear, unaccented English. And as he drew closer, the moonlight caught his feet in the stirrups. He was wearing heavy leather cavalry boots. "Check the wagon," another man shouted. "Crowley said there might be cash in the lockbox." Crowley, the name cut through Joe's panic. These were not Navajo. "Please," Joe stammered, holding up her hands. "I have no money, just bread and dry goods." "Shut up." The leader swung his rifle, the stock slamming into the side of the wagon, splintering the wood. "Tip it over, make it look like a raid." 2 of the men dismounted and grabbed the side of the wagon. They began to heave. The wagon rocked violently. Joe clung to the seat, screaming. "Hey!" The voice came from above, sharp, commanding, and ringing with authority. The attackers froze. They looked up toward the canyon rim. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the night sky on the high ridge. Even in the darkness, the outline was unmistakable. The lean, hard shapes of true warriors. Nez Greyhawk raised his rifle. He did not scream. He did not ululate. He simply spoke a single phrase in Dine, his voice echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Then he fired. The bullet struck the dirt inches from the leader's horse. The horse bolted, throwing the man from his saddle. "It is Greyhawk," one of the fake raiders yelled, panic shrilling in his voice. "It is the real ones. Let us go." They did not fight. Cowards who preyed on women in the dark had no stomach for a fight with Nez Greyhawk. They scrambled onto their horses, abandoning the wagon, and tore off down the canyon in a cloud of dust. But the damage was done. Bessie, terrified by the gunshot and the shouting, lunged forward. The wagon, already teetering from the men's assault, hit a large rock with a sickening crunch of wood. The wagon flipped. Joe was thrown clear of the seat. She hit the ground hard, the air driven from her lungs. She rolled, the momentum carrying her toward the edge of the road where the ground fell away into a steep, rocky wash. She clawed at the dirt, her fingers scraping against stone, but her heavy skirts tangled around her legs. She slid over the edge. "Help!" she gasped. She tumbled down the steep slope, dust filling her mouth, rocks bruising her arms and ribs. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the final, bone-shattering impact at the bottom of the ravine. It never came. Her slide was halted abruptly, a hand strong, calloused, and unyielding clamped around her wrist. Joe gasped, her eyes flying open. She was dangling precariously on a shelf of rock, 10 feet above the dry creek bed. Nez Greyhawk lay flat on his stomach on the ledge above her, his arm extended, his grip like iron. He had slid down the slope after her, moving with the speed of a mountain lion. He looked down at her. His face was inches from hers. He was not straining. He was not grimacing. He held her weight, all 200 pounds of her, as if she were made of feathers. "I have you," he said. His voice was calm, deep, and utterly certain. Joe stared up at him, paralyzed by shock and the sudden proximity. This was the man she was supposed to fear, the savage, and yet, looking into his dark eyes, she saw only focus. He pulled. He did not jerk her. He pulled with a steady, powerful motion. He dragged her up onto the ledge, away from the drop. Joe scrambled for purchase, her body pressing against his as he hauled her to safety. For a moment, they lay there in the dirt, tangled together. Joe was breathing in ragged gasps, her chest heaving against his chest. She could feel the hard muscle of his arms, the steady thrum of his heart. He did not push her away. He did not make a joke about her heaviness. He simply held her there until the trembling in her limbs began to subside. "Are you hurt?" he asked, sitting up and pulling her into a sitting position. He kept one hand on her back to steady her. I do not think so," Joe whispered. She looked at her hands. They were scraped and bleeding. Her dress was torn. Who were they?" "Ghosts," Nez said, his voice hard. "Ghosts paid by living men." He looked at her, his expression softening slightly. "You cannot go back to town tonight. Your wagon is broken. Your horse is gone." "I have nowhere to go," Joe said, the despair crashing back in. "You have somewhere," Nez said. He stood up and offered her his hand. Joe looked at the hand. It was scarred and brown. Taking it felt like crossing a line, stepping out of the world she knew and into something forbidden. She reached up and took it. He pulled her to her feet with that same effortless strength. Joe woke to the smell of burning cedar and sage. She was lying on a pile of soft sheepskins. Above her, the ceiling was made of logs arranged in a domed pattern, chinked with earth. It was a hogan. She tried to sit up, but a gentle hand pushed her back down. "Rest," a voice said. An elderly Navajo woman leaned over her. Her face was a landscape of deep wrinkles, her hair a silver cloud tied back with white yarn. She wore a velvet blouse of deep indigo and layers of calico skirts. She held a clay cup to Joe's lips. "Drink," the woman said. Her English was heavily accented but understandable. "Willow bark, for the pain." Joe drank. The liquid was bitter, but it warmed her belly. She looked around. The interior of the hogan was sparse but clean. A fire burned in the center pit, the smoke rising through a hole in the roof. Nez was sitting on the north side of the hogan, cleaning his rifle. He looked up as she moved. "Where am I?" Joe asked, her voice raspy. "You are in the home of my grandmother, Azatso," Nez said. "We are in the canyon behind the mesa. Safe." Joe touched her forehead. It was bandaged. "The men, the ones who attacked me, they had feathers. They yelled like they are told Indians yell in the dime novels." Nez finished for her. He set the rifle down and moved closer to the fire. "Did you see their boots? Did you hear their curses?" "Yes," Joe said. "They were white men. They work for Silas Crowley," Nez said flatly. "They attack wagons, burn fences, and leave Navajo arrows behind." They want the army to clear us out so the railroad can take the water. Joe shivered. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The town believed lies. She had believed lies. Why? She asked. Why save me? I am one of them. I am from the town. Nez looked at her. In the firelight, the sharp angles of his face were softened. You are not one of them, he said. I saw you at the well. I saw you at the dance hall. Joe flinched. I saw a man who was a fool, Nez said, and I saw a woman who walked away with her head up. He picked up a stick and poked the fire. The men who attacked you, if you go back now, they will finish what they started, or they will say the Navajo took you. If you walk into town tomorrow, alive, saying white men attacked you, Crowley will not let that stand. So I'm a prisoner, Joe asked, fear spiking again. No, Nez said. He looked her in the eye. You are a guest. You can leave now. I will give you a horse, but you are hurt. Your spirit is bruised more than your body. He gestured to the door, where the morning light was cutting a sharp rectangle on the dirt floor. Go, or stay, he said. Here, we do not judge the size of the cornstalk, only the sweetness of the corn. Joe looked at the door. Through it, she could see the red rocks and the vast, empty sky. If she went back to Aunt May's disappointment, to the whispers, to Ethan's mockery. She went back to being Fat Joe. She looked at the grandmother, who was watching her with kind, dark eyes. She looked at Nez. He was not looking at her body with disgust. He was waiting for her decision with the patience of a stone. For the first time in her life, the silence around her did not feel lonely. It felt peaceful. Joe lay back down on the sheepskins. The pain in her ribs was dull, but the pain in her heart felt, for the first time, manageable. I cannot ride, Joe said softly. Not today. Nez nodded. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, not mocking, but approving. Then eat, he said. My grandmother has made blue corn mush. It will make you strong. Joe watched him as he moved to help his grandmother. She was in a strange world, a world she had been taught to fear. But as the grandmother handed her a bowl of warm porridge, Joe realized she felt safer here, in this mud-walled hut with a savage warrior, than she had ever felt in the parlor of the Traveler's Rest. She took the bowl. The warmth of it seeped into her hands. She had fallen off the edge of her world, and she had been caught. Now, she had to decide if she wanted to climb back up, or build a new path entirely. 3 days had passed since the accident in Shadow Gorge, and for Joanna Mercer, time had begun to move at a different rhythm. In Red Mesa Crossing, time was measured by the shrill whistle of the train, the chime of the church bell, and the frenetic demands of hungry patrons. Here, in the shelter of the canyon, time was measured by the movement of the sun across the red sandstone walls and the steady, rhythmic breathing of the land itself. Joe sat on a woven blanket outside the hogan. A heavy stone met it between her legs. She was grinding dried corn into meal, a task Azatso, Nez's grandmother, had shown her with patient, silent hands. It was hard work. Sweat trickled down Joe's temples, plastering stray locks of hair to her neck. Her shoulders burned, and she could feel the soft flesh of her midsection pressing against the stone with every forward motion. She paused, instinctively pulling at the loose fabric of the borrowed calico blouse she wore. It was tight across her bosom, and she felt a familiar wave of shame wash over her. She was a large woman taking up space in a small world. She tried to sit smaller, hunching her shoulders to hide the breadth of her back, sucking in her stomach until her ribs ached. It was a habit honed over a lifetime of trying to disappear while remaining entirely visible. You will break the stone if you fight it, a voice said. Joe jumped, nearly upsetting the bowl of cornmeal. Nez Greyhawk was standing a few feet away, holding a string of trout he had just caught from the creek. He moved with such silence that he seemed to materialize out of the air itself. I am not fighting it, Joe said, wiping her face with her sleeve, embarrassed to be caught sweating. I am not used to this work. I am slow. Nez stepped closer and hung the fish on a drying rack. He turned to watch her. His gaze was not critical, nor was it the leering, measuring look she received from the men in town. It was simply observant. "You are not slow," Nez said. "You have strong hands. The women in town, the ones with waists like willow branches, they would faint after 10 minutes of this. You have filled 2 bowls." Joe looked down at her hands. They were broad, the fingers thick and capable. For years, she had hated them. She had wanted delicate, pale hands that did nothing heavier than hold a needle. Strength is not considered a virtue for a woman where I come from. Joe murmured, looking away. "We are supposed to be decorative, like China dolls." "China dolls break," Nez said. He sat down on a log opposite her, beginning to sharpen his knife with a whetstone. "Here, we value the firekeeper, the one who can carry the wood, grind the corn, and hold the roof up when the wind blows. My grandmother calls you ha-ah-ah. What does that mean?" "It means the one who stands in the east, the sunrise. But also, in my own thought, it means the one who keeps the fire." He looked at her directly. "Do not hunch your shoulders. Joe, you are built to carry the world. Do not apologize for it." The use of her name, stripped of any mocking adjective, made Joe's breath catch. He did not call her Miss Mercer or Big Joe, just Joe. And in his mouth, it sounded like a solid thing, a stone in a foundation, not a burden. Later that afternoon, the canyon grew cooler as the shadows lengthened. Joe sat near the fire pit, listening. Several elders from neighboring camps had gathered. They spoke mostly in Dine, a language of soft clicks and flowing vowels that sounded like water running over rocks. But Nez translated for her in low tones. They were talking about the iron snake, the railroad. "The soldiers came again yesterday," an old man with a face like weathered leather said. His English broken but fierce. "They say we steal cattle. They say we burn the fences near the water. It is a lie," Azatso spat, stirring a pot of stew. "We have our own sheep. We do not need the white man's stringy cows. They found arrows," the old man continued, "in the side of a dead steer, Navajo arrows." Nez spoke up then, his voice hard. "They were not Navajo arrows. I saw the ones from the attack on Joe's wagon. The fletching was wrong. They used turkey feathers tied with red thread. We use hawk or eagle, and we tie with sinew. These are props. Toys made by men who read stories in books but do not know the land." Joe felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She remembered the men who had attacked her, the painted faces that smeared with sweat, the cavalry boots. "Silas Crowley," Joe whispered. The circle of elders looked at her. "The man who runs the cattle," Joe said, her voice trembling slightly but gaining strength. He came to the inn 2 weeks ago. I heard him talking to the sheriff. He said the investors were nervous. He said the land needed to be pacified before the next section of track could be laid. He looked at the map. Right at this canyon." She realized with a sickening jolt that she had been complicit. She had served Silas his coffee. She had smiled when he tipped his hat. She had heard the townspeople call the Navajos savages and thieves, and she had said nothing, grateful only that their mockery was directed at someone other than her for a moment. "I stood there," Joe confessed, looking at Nez. "I let them talk. I thought it had nothing to do with me. I believed you were dangerous because it was easier than believing the sheriff was a liar." She pulled a small, battered notebook from her apron pocket. It was where she usually wrote recipes. Now, she opened it to a fresh page. "Tell me," she said to Nez. "Tell me exactly what the arrows looked like. Tell me where the fences were burned. I will write it down. If I ever get back, I will not be silent anymore." Nez looked at the notebook, then at her. A look of profound respect crossed his face. "Write this. Joe, the boots of the men who attacked the sheep camp had a star pattern on the heel. Army issue, or surplus sold to cowboys." As Joe wrote, the sun dipped below the rim, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and orange. She was no longer just a cook hiding in a kitchen. She was a witness. The evening brought a chill that bit through the thin fabric of Joe's dress. The camp was preparing for the night. Joe stood near the supply cache, a small cave at the base of the cliff where sacks of corn and dried beans were stored. She reached for a large burlap sack of corn, intending to bring it to the grandmother. It was heavy, weighing perhaps 50 pounds. Joe gripped the corners and heaved. She was strong enough to lift it, but the awkward angle made her stumble. She let out a grunt of exertion, her hip bumping against the rock wall. "Careful!" a voice rumbled right behind her ear, before she could drop the sack or regain her balance. Nez was there. He did not push her aside to take the burden from her. Instead, he stepped in close behind her, his chest pressing against her back. He reached around her, his arms encompassing hers. His hands covered her hands on the sack. "Lift with your legs," he murmured. Together. For a moment, Joe could not move. The sensation of being surrounded by him was overwhelming. He was a large man, tall and broad, but she was a large woman. Usually, when a man stood this close to her, which was rare, she felt like a giant. An oaf. She felt like she was spilling over the edges of their embrace. But with Nez, she felt matched. His arms were hard and warm against her soft, fleshy ones. His chest was a solid wall against her back. He did not pull away. He did not flinch at the contact with her wide hips or her heavy arms. He pressed closer. "Ready?" he asked. His breath ghosted over the sensitive skin of her neck, sending a shiver racing down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Yes," Joe whispered, her voice sounding breathless to her own ears. "Up," he said. They lifted the sack together, their bodies moving in a synchronized rhythm. It came up easily, light as a feather shared between them. They turned and set it down on the flat stone near the fire. Nez did not step away immediately. He kept his hands on hers for a heartbeat longer than necessary. He was standing so close she could smell the scent of him sage smoke, leather, and the clean, masculine scent of skin. Joe turned her head slightly, looking up at him. His face was inches away. His eyes were dark pools reflecting the firelight. In them, she saw a heat that mirrored the sudden flushing of her own skin. It was not the heat of anger, nor the heat of shame. It was a recognition, a question. "You are warm," he said quietly. It was a simple statement, but the way he said it made it sound like the highest compliment a man could pay a woman in a frozen desert. I've always been too warm," Joe stammered, instinctually trying to make a self-deprecating joke. "Too much insulation." Nez frowned, a small crease appearing between his brows. He reached out and, with a hesitation that was heartbreakingly tender, brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. His knuckles grazed her cheek. "A fire needs fuel to burn. Joe," he said, "do not wish away the fuel. I do not want to hold a cold ghost. I want a woman who is real." He stepped back then, leaving Joe standing by the fire, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wrapped her arms around herself, but for the first time in her life, she was not trying to hide her body. She was trying to hold on to the sensation of his touch. The fragile peace of the canyon was shattered the next morning. A rider, a young Navajo boy on a sweating pony, came galloping into the camp. He slid from his horse and spoke rapidly to Nez and the grandmother. His face was pale with fear. Nez listened, his expression hardening into stone. He turned to Joe. "Silas Crowley has gone to the fort," Nez said, his voice grim. "He has told the colonel that the Navajo have kidnapped a white woman. You." Joe gasped. "Me?" "He claims we attacked your wagon, took you captive, and are holding you for ransom. He claims we are savages who need to be put down. The colonel has authorized a scouting party to find the camp. If they find us, they have orders to shoot any warrior who resists and return you to civilization." "But that is a lie," Joe cried. "I came with you. You saved me." "It does not matter what is true," Nez said, checking the load in his Winchester rifle. "It matters what the white men believe. If they come here and find you, they will kill me and my brothers to rescue you. And then they will take the land." "Then we have to tell them," Joe said. "I have to tell them." "I will take you to the edge of the town," Nez said. "You can walk in. Tell them you escaped. Tell them we are gone. It is the only way to keep the soldiers out of the canyon for now." "No," Joe said. The word came out louder than she intended. She stood up, smoothing her skirt. "If I walk in alone, saying I escaped, I confirm his lie. I confirm that you are a kidnapper." She stepped closer to him. "We go together. We ride right down the main street of Red Mesa Crossing. I will tell the colonel, the sheriff, and everyone who stares that Silas Crowley is a liar. I have my notebook, I have the dates, and I have my voice." Nez looked at her. "They will destroy you. Joe, they will say you have lost your mind. They will say ugly things about a white woman who rides with an Indian." "They already say I am ugly," Joe said, her chin lifting. "Let them talk. I am done hiding in the kitchen." Nez stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. It was a sharp, decisive movement. "Get your things." The ride back to Red Mesa Crossing was grueling. Since Joe's wagon was destroyed and Nez had only his warhorse, a large Appaloosa named Ghost, they had to ride double. Nez mounted first, then offered his arm to pull Joe up behind him. It was an awkward scramble. Joe had to hike her skirts up, revealing her ankles and calves, struggling to hoist her weight onto the animal's hindquarters. "I am too heavy," she panted, humiliated. "The horse cannot take it." "He can carry a deer carcass and a rider," Nez said calmly, gripping her forearm and hauling her up. "You are just fine." "Hold on to me." Joe settled behind him. There was no saddle cantle to separate them. She had to wrap her arms around his waist to stay seated. She pressed her front against his back. It was intimate, scandalous, and necessary. As they rode out of the canyon and onto the scrub plains, the evidence of Silas's treachery was waiting for them. 3 miles from town, they passed a sheep camp that had been burned. The blackened circles of the Hogans were like sores on the earth. The carcasses of a dozen sheep lay bloating in the sun. Shot, not butchered for meat. Nez stopped the horse. He did not speak, but Joe could feel the tension in his muscles, hard as iron beneath her arms. "Look." Nez pointed to the dirt. There, preserved in the dried mud near the trough, were boot prints. The heel had a distinct star pattern. "The same as the men who stopped my wagon," Joe said, her voice cold. "I saw that star when the leader fell." "Crowley's foreman wears those boots," Nez said. "I have seen him in town." "Then we have him," Joe said. She tightened her grip around Nez's waist. "Ride, Nez. Let us finish this." Red Mesa Crossing was busy with the midday trade when they arrived. The sound of hammers on the new bank building rang out. Wagons clattered. Then, silence spread like a ripple in a pond. It started at the edge of town, near the livery stable, and moved inward. Hammers stopped mid-swing. Conversations died. Riding down the center of the main street was Nez Greyhawk, the feared Navajo warrior, his face impassive, his rifle sheathed. And sitting behind him, arms wrapped tight around his waist, her head held high, was Joanna Mercer. Joe felt the eyes of the town on her. She felt the weight of their judgment pressing down like the midday sun. "Would you look at that?" a woman on the boardwalk whispered loudly. "The fat girl and the savage. Have you ever seen anything so shameful?" Another hissed. "She looks like she is crushing that poor horse." "Ran off with a buck," a man spat into the dust. "Disgrace to her race. I always knew there was something wrong with her." Joe heard every word. They stung, sharp and venomous. Her instinct was to bury her face in Nez's back, to hide, to cry. But then she felt Nez's hand briefly cover hers where they were clasped at his waist. A quick, reassuring squeeze. "I need warm arms, not a tiny waist." She straightened her spine. She looked directly at the woman who had whispered. She looked at the men gaping from the saloon porch. She did not look away. They rode straight up to the sheriff's office, where Silas Crowley and Sheriff Cutler were standing on the porch, looking as if they had seen a ghost. Silas's cigar fell from his mouth. He looked at Joe, dirty, hair windblown, her dress torn, but alive and radiating a furious dignity he had never seen in her before. Nez halted the horse. The dust swirled around them. "I hear you have been looking for me. Mr. Crowley," Joe said. Her voice was not the soft, apologetic voice of the cook. It was loud, clear, and steady. "And I hear you have been telling stories about my friends." Silas narrowed his eyes. Recovering his composure, he stepped forward, a sneer curling his lip. "Get down from there. Joanna," he said, his voice dripping with false concern that barely masked the threat. "You are clearly in shock. The savage has bewildered you. Step away before he hurts you. The only person who has hurt me—" "Silas," Joe said, sliding down from the horse and landing with a heavy thud that kicked up dust. "Is you—" She stood next to the horse, putting a hand on Nez's knee as he remained mounted. She faced the sheriff, Silas, and the gathering crowd. "I am not a captive," Joe declared, "and I have a lot to say to the colonel about who is really raiding the wagons." The conflict had moved from the shadows of the canyon to the dusty street. The war was no longer just about land. It was about truth, and Joe Mercer was standing on the front line. The dust of the street confrontation settled, but the air remained thick with unsaid threats. Silas Crowley stood on the boardwalk, brushing an invisible speck of dirt from his lapel. He looked at Joanna Mercer not as a woman who had just challenged his authority, but as a problem to be managed. "You have had a difficult ordeal, Joanna," Silas said, his voice smooth as oil. "Shock makes the mind conjure strange enemies. But I am a forgiving man. The offer stands. My ranch needs a cook who understands how to feed working men. The pay is $20 a month. Think of it as a way to rehabilitate your reputation." He smiled, and it was a cold, predatory thing. He believed he was offering her a lifeline, assuming a woman like her had no other options. Joanna stood beside the large Appaloosa horse, her hand still resting near Nez's knee. She looked at Silas, then at the sheriff, and finally at Ethan Doyle, who hovered in the background with a look of petulant disdain. "I will think on it," Joe said. It was not a surrender. It was a stall. Nez remained silent, his dark eyes fixed on Silas. He did not need to speak. His presence alone was a challenge. With a subtle movement of his reins, he turned the horse. "Go home, Joe," Nez said softly. "Lock your door." The return to the Traveler's Rest was not the homecoming Joe might have hoped for. As she walked through the front door, the silence of the inn was heavier than the heat outside. Aunt May was waiting in the parlor. She sat stiffly in her high-backed chair, a lace handkerchief clutched in her hand. When she saw Joe dusty, disheveled, and smelling of horse sweat, she did not rush forward with a hug. She let out a long, ragged sigh. 3 days, Aunt May said, her voice trembling. 3 days you have been gone, with a savage. "I was injured, Aunt May," Joe said, her exhaustion making her legs heavy. "Nez saved my life. Men attacked the wagon. Men," May scoffed. "Or phantoms. The whole town is talking. Joanna, they say you ran off. They say you are loose." She looked Joe up and down, her gaze lingering on the torn waist of Joe's dress. "They say a woman of your size takes whatever attention she can get, even if it is from a heathen." The words struck Joe harder than the fall into the canyon. It was the confirmation of her deepest fear that her family saw her not as a victim or a survivor, but as a desperate embarrassment. "I am going to bathe," Joe said, her voice dull. "And then I am going to sleep." She walked past her aunt, climbing the stairs with heavy steps. She could hear May weeping softly in the parlor, crying not for Joe's safety, but for the family name. That evening, the heat broke, leaving behind a stillness that felt breathless. Joe sat on the back porch of the inn, hidden by the shadows of the trellis. She had scrubbed the dust from her skin, but she could not scrub away the feeling of exposure. She was wearing her nightgown, with a heavy shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders despite the warmth. Underneath, she had loosened her corset, but the red welts remained angry and deep against her skin. She pressed her hands against her midsection, feeling the soft yield of flesh. Loose, desperate, too much. The words circled in her mind like vultures. A twig snapped in the darkness of the yard. Joe stiffened, pulling the shawl tighter. "It is me," a low voice said. Nez stepped out of the shadows. He had left his horse further back in the scrub. He moved silently up the steps, stopping a few feet away from her. He looked different without his rifle, though no less dangerous. He looked tired. "The sheriff came to the camp," Nez said quietly. "He asked questions. He looked for the wagon. He found nothing because the rain in the canyon washed the tracks away." "He will not believe us," Joe said. She stared down at her hands, which were resting on her lap. "Silas has money. We have only words." "We need more than words," Nez said. "We need his own ink. You said he keeps a ledger." "He does," Joe said. "But how do we get it? His office is guarded." "I can get in," Nez said, "but I cannot read his scribbles. I do not know what I'm looking for." Joe remained silent. The plan forming in her mind was terrifying. But the alternative, letting Silas win, letting the town be right, was worse. She shifted on the bench, and the movement caused her shawl to slip. She yanked it back up, crossing her arms over her stomach defensively. The shame of the afternoon, of Aunt May's words, bubbled up in her throat. "You should not be here," Joe whispered. "If they see you—" "I do not care what they see," Nez said. He stepped closer. "But I care what you see. You are hiding again. Joe—" Joe let out a shaky breath. The tears she had held back all day finally spilled over. "They call me fat," she murmured, her voice shaking so hard it was barely audible. "Maybe they are right. Maybe I am just too much of everything, too big to hide, too big to love, just a big, foolish target." She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for him to offer platitudes. She waited for him to say, "You have a pretty face," or "You are strong," the way people did when they wanted to avoid the truth of her body. Nez did not do that. He stepped into the small space of the porch. He reached out and took her hands, pulling them away from her stomach where she was clutching herself. He did not let go. He smiled, slow and certain, the expression crinkling the corners of his dark eyes. "I need warm arms, not a tiny waist," he said. His voice was a deep rumble that vibrated in the air between them. "I need someone who doesn't disappear when I pull them close." Joe opened her eyes. He was looking at her with a hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with peace. "Nez," she breathed. He moved his hands from her fingers to her arms. He slid his palms up the soft, full flesh of her upper arms, his touch firm and appreciative. He did not treat her like glass. He treated her like the earth, solid, bountiful, and real. "You are not too much," he whispered. "You are just enough to fill a man's empty hands." He pulled her to him. Joe did not pull back. For the first time in her 26 years, she did not try to suck in her breath or make herself smaller. She let herself be drawn against him. Her forehead rested against the solid wall of his chest. She heard his heart beating, a steady, strong rhythm. She felt the heat of him, and she knew he could feel the heat of her. Her breasts pressed against his buckskin shirt, her hips meeting his. There was no gap between them. She fit, miraculously, wonderfully. She fit. They stood there for a long time in the dark, swaying slightly. It was not a kiss. It was something more foundational. It was an anchor dropping into the sea. When Nez finally pulled back, he did not let go of her arms. "We need the ledger," he said, his voice husky but focused. Joe nodded, wiping her cheeks. She felt a new steel in her spine. "Silas offered me a job, cooking at the ranch. He thinks I am desperate. He thinks I am stupid." Nez frowned. "It is dangerous." "He will not look at me," Joe said, a bitter but triumphant smile touching her lips. "Men like Silas, they do not see the servants, especially the ones they find unappealing. I will be invisible." 2 days later, Joanna Mercer walked into the kitchen of the Double C Ranch. The ranch house was a sprawling structure of timber and stone. Meant to impress, the kitchen was hot, smelling of grease and stale coffee. Silas Crowley met her at the door, looking smug. "I knew you would come to your senses. Joanna, it is good to see you know your place." "Thank you, Mr. Crowley," Joe said, keeping her head down. She wore her plainest dress, stained with flour. She let her shoulders slump. She played the part of the defeated woman perfectly. For the next week, Jo became a ghost in the machine of Silas's empire. She cooked vats of chili, baked hundreds of biscuits, and scrubbed floors. She endured the pinches and lewd jokes of the ranch hands. She listened. She learned that the foreman, a man named Pike, was the one organizing the raids. She learned that they were expecting a shipment of dynamite, but she needed the book. The opportunity came on a Thursday night. Silas was hosting a poker game in the parlor for the sheriff and a visiting railroad investor. The whiskey was flowing freely. "More ice, girl," Silas shouted toward the kitchen. Jo carried the bucket of ice into the parlor. The room was thick with smoke. "Gentlemen," Silas was saying, waving his hand, "the expansion is guaranteed. The savages will be gone by the first snow. I have arrangements in place." Jo set the ice down. Her eyes darted to the desk in the corner. The drawer was slightly open. Inside, she saw the black leather spine of a ledger. "Get out," Silas snapped at her. Jo retreated to the kitchen. She waited. 10 minutes. 20. The laughter in the parlor grew louder, more raucous. She crept back into the hallway. The men were distracted by a large pot on the final hand. Jo slipped into the shadows of the room, behind the heavy velvet drapes, and then moved to the desk while their backs were turned. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She opened the drawer. She grabbed the ledger. She opened it. Her eyes scanned the pages. There it was. July 4th, payment to Pike and Boys, costume materials, $50. August 10th, payment to Sheriff Cutler, silence, $100. Note, paint up like Navajo. It was the smoking gun. She heard a chair scrape back. "I need to relieve myself," Silas's voice boomed. Jo panicked. She could not carry the ledger out. It was too big to hide in her hand. She ripped the damning pages from the binding, 3 pages of detailed accounts. Where to hide them? She had no pockets deep enough. She acted on instinct. She turned her back to the room, reached down her dress, and shoved the folded papers deep inside her corset, pressing them flat against the soft flesh of her stomach, right beneath her breasts. Her size, the very thing she had been mocked for, became her vault. The tight lacing and the curve of her body concealed the crinkle of paper perfectly. She grabbed a dirty glass from a side table just as Silas turned around. "What are you doing?" Silas demanded, swaying slightly, just clearing the glasses. "Mr. Crowley," Jo said, her voice trembling only slightly. Silas looked at her, his eyes glazing over. He saw a fat cook holding a dirty glass. He did not see a spy. "Useless," he muttered. "Go on, get out." Jo walked out of the room, the evidence burning against her skin. It was well past midnight when Jo left the ranch. She had told the foreman she needed to check on her aunt. She walked the 2 miles back to town under the cover of darkness. Her feet ached, but her mind was racing. She had it. She had the proof. She reached the edge of town, intending to cut through the alley behind the livery stable to reach the inn. In a hurry. "Joanna?" Jo froze. Ethan Doyle stepped out from behind a stack of hay bales. He was holding a lantern, the light casting harsh shadows on his face. He looked disheveled, his eyes bright with a mixture of whiskey and malice. "Ethan," Jo said, clutching her shawl. "Let me pass." "I saw you leaving the ranch," Ethan said, stepping closer. "Silas told me to keep an eye on you. He thinks you are just a cook. But I know you, don't I? You are the girl who likes to write letters. Move, Ethan," Jo said, stepping to the side. He blocked her path. "What do you have, food-stealing scraps, or are you running back to your Indian buck?" He grabbed her arm. His fingers dug into her flesh. "Let go of me," Jo shouted. "You make me sick," Ethan hissed, his face close to hers. "I tried to be nice to you. I tried to be polite. And you run off with a savage. You let him touch you. A woman like you should be grateful any white man even looks at her." "I'm grateful," Jo said, her voice rising. "I am grateful I found out what a small, pathetic man you are before I made a mistake." "You fat cow," Ethan snarled. He raised his hand to strike her. Jo flinched, bracing for the blow. It never landed. A hand reached out of the darkness. a hand that moved with the speed of a striking snake and caught Ethan's wrist in midair. Nez Greyhawk stepped into the lantern light. He did not look like a cook. He did not look like a servant. He looked like death, carved from copper. He twisted Ethan's wrist. Ethan shrieked, dropping the lantern. It sputtered in the dust but stayed lit. "Touch her again," Nez said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "And you will lose the hand." Nez shoved Ethan backward. Ethan stumbled, falling into the dirt. He scrambled backward, crab-walking away from the tall Navajo warrior. You're dead," Ethan stammered. "Silas will kill you, both of you." "Tell him," Nez said. "Tell him I am waiting." Ethan scrambled to his feet and ran, his boots clattering on the wooden boardwalk as he fled toward the ranch. Joe let out a sob of relief. Nez turned to her immediately. "Did he hurt you?" "No," Joe said. She reached into the bodice of her dress and pulled out the crumpled pages. "I have it. Nez, I have the papers." Nez took the papers, his eyes widening as he saw the rows of figures and names. "This is it," he said. "This is the end of him." "Or the beginning of the war," Joe said. "At the ranch." Ethan Doyle burst into Silas's office, gasping for breath. Silas was sober now, counting the money from the poker game. "They are together," Ethan wheezed. "In town, the girl, she stole something. She was bragging about papers." Silas stopped counting. His face went very still. He looked at the ledger on his desk. He opened it. He saw the torn binding, the missing pages. His face turned a shade of purple that was almost black in the lamplight. "She has the payroll," Silas whispered. "If she shows that to the army, I hang—" He stood up, overturning his chair. "Wake the boys," Silas commanded, his voice shaking with rage. "Wake Pike! Wake everyone." "What are we going to do?" Ethan asked, trembling. "We are going to finish this," Silas said. He pulled a heavy revolver from his drawer. "We are going to catch them before they reach the fort. We will intercept them at the pass. And this time, there will be no survivors, no witnesses, just a tragic Indian attack." He looked at Ethan. "You want to be a big man. Doyle, grab a gun. Tonight we hunt." The die was cast. The evidence was in hand, but the road to justice led straight through the narrowest, most dangerous choke point in the territory. And Silas Crowley was bringing hell with him. The heat in the canyon was a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of Joanna Mercer as she rode behind Nez Greyhawk. The midday sun reflected off the red sandstone walls, turning the narrow pass into an oven beneath her bodice, pressed tight against her damp skin by the corset she had loosed but not discarded. The stolen ledger pages scratched and rustled. They were uncomfortable, a constant reminder of the danger they were riding toward. But Joanna welcomed the discomfort. It was real. It was leverage. "We are close," Nez said. His voice was low, vibrating through his chest and into hers where she pressed against his back. "The bridge is just around the bend. Colonel Holloway gave his word he would meet us there." "Do you trust him?" Joanna asked, shouting to be heard over the wind and the clatter of hooves on stone. "I trust his curiosity," Nez replied. "He is a man of regulations. He does not like it when civilians play soldier. If we show him the proof that Crowley is mocking his authority, he will act." The meeting place was Devil's Backbone, a wooden trestle bridge spanning a deep, dry gorge that marked the unofficial border between the town's grazing lands and the Navajo territory. It was neutral ground, open and exposed. As the Appaloosa rounded the final twist of the canyon, the bridge came into view. It was empty. The timber structure looked fragile against the vastness of the chasm. There was no sign of the blue uniforms of the cavalry. There was only the wind whistling through the slat fences and the cawing of a solitary crow. Nez pulled the horse to a halt. The animal danced nervously, ears pricked forward. "He is not here," Joanna said, her heart sinking. "Something is wrong," Nez murmured. He scanned the ridgeline, his eyes narrowing. "The birds are silent." Before the sentence was finished, the silence shattered. A crack, sharp as a whip, echoed off the canyon walls. A puff of dust exploded from the ground inches from the horse's front hooves. "Ambush!" Nez roared. He wheeled the horse around. driving his heels into its flanks. Another shot rang out. Then a volley. Bullets whined through the air like angry hornets. One struck the sandstone cliff next to them, sending a spray of rock shards into Joanna's face. "Hold on," Nez commanded. He steered the horse not back the way they came, but toward a cluster of large boulders near the bridge approach. It was the only cover. They reached the rocks just as a bullet tore through the saddlebag. Nez practically threw himself off the horse, pulling Joanna down with him. They hit the dirt hard, scrambling behind the cover of the granite slabs. Nez slapped the horse's flank, sending the animal galloping away to safety down the wash. "Stay down," Nez hissed. He pulled his Winchester rifle from the scabbard he had grabbed as they fell. He peered around the edge of the rock. "They are up on the north ridge. 3 of them, maybe 4. "Is it Silas?" Joanna asked, her voice trembling. She pressed her back against the warm stone, gasping for breath. The run had winded her, and the corset felt like a vice. "I see Pike's hat," Nez said, cycling the lever of his rifle. "And I see the shine of a scoped rifle. That belongs to Silas." A bullet smashed into the top of their rock, showering them with dust. Joanna covered her head with her arms. This was not a story in a book. This was loud, dirty, and terrifying. The smell of gunpowder drifted down to them, acrid and metallic. "We are pinned," Nez said calmly. He raised his rifle, took a breath, and fired. A cry of pain echoed from the ridge. "One less, but they have the high ground. They are trying to keep us here until they can flank us." Joanna looked around. They were trapped in a small depression of rocks. Behind them was the drop into the gorge. In front of them, the open ground leading to the bridge. To the left, a narrow goat path wound down from the ridge. "Nez," Joanna whispered, gripping his arm. "Look." She pointed to the left. A figure was moving down the goat path, slipping from boulder to boulder, trying to get behind them. It was a man in a duster coat, holding a shotgun. He moved quickly, using the noise of the rifle fire from the ridge to mask his approach. Nez whipped his head around, but he had just fired at the ridge. He worked the lever of his gun, but it clicked empty. He reached for his belt to reload, but the man on the path was already raising his shotgun. He was less than 20 feet away. "Drop it, Indian!" the man shouted. It was one of the ranch hands Joanna recognized from the kitchen. Nez froze. If he moved to load, the man would fire. The spread of a shotgun at that range would kill them both. Joanna looked at the man. He was looking at Nez. He was ignoring her completely. To him, she was just a piece of scenery, a frightened, useless woman cowering in the dirt. Something hot and fierce ignited in Joanna's chest. It was the same heat she had felt when she looked at the ledger. It was the anger of a lifetime of being overlooked, undervalued, and dismissed. "He thinks I am nothing," she thought. "He thinks I am just soft flesh." She was soft. She was heavy. She was 200 pounds of leverage. Joanna did not scream. She did not hesitate. From her crouching position, she coiled her legs beneath her. She was a woman who had hauled 50-pound sacks of flour every day for 10 years. She had legs like tree trunks. As the gunman adjusted his aim toward Nez's chest, Joanna lunged. She exploded from her crouch with terrifying speed. She did not try to hit him with her fists. She simply threw her entire body at him. She was a cannonball of blue calico and fury. The gunman saw her a fraction of a second too late. His eyes widened in shock. He tried to swing the shotgun, but Joanna was already there. She slammed into him with the force of a runaway carriage. Her shoulder hit his chest, and her momentum carried them both. The air left his lungs in a wet whoosh. The shotgun discharged harmlessly into the sky as he was lifted off his feet. They crashed into the dirt together, Joanna landing on top of him. The impact was bone-jarring. She felt his ribs crack under her weight. He wheezed, pinned completely flat by her mass. Joanna rolled off him, gasping, her hair wild and full of dust. She scrambled to her knees, grabbing a heavy rock, ready to strike, but the man was out cold, gasping for air, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Joe!" Nez shouted. He had finished reloading. He fired 2 quick shots at the ridge to keep the others' heads down, then scrambled over to her. He looked at the unconscious man, then at Joanna. His eyes were wide with amazement. "You took him down," Nez said. "You flew at him like a bear." I just," Joanna panted, wiping sweat from her eyes. "I used what I had." "Get back to cover," Nez yelled. Grabbing her hand, they dove back behind the main boulders just as bullets chewed up the ground where they had been standing. "That was the flanker," Nez said, a fierce grin breaking through his stoic mask. "Now they have to come down to us if they want to finish this. Or they wait until dark," Joanna said. "They do not have until dark." Nez said, "Listen." In the distance, faint but growing louder, was the sound of a bugle. "The Colonel," Joanna breathed. "Silas hears it too." Nez said, "He is desperate now. He has to kill us before the soldiers see us alive." Suddenly, the firing from the ridge stopped. "Are they running?" Joanna asked. "No," Nez said, his voice tightening. "He is coming down." Silas Crowley emerged from the rocks 30 yards away. He was not hiding anymore. He walked with a maniacal purpose, holding a heavy revolver. Beside him was Pike, the foreman, bleeding from a shoulder wound but still holding a rifle. "Come out!" Silas screamed. His face was red, his suit covered in dust. "Come out, you savage, and bring the girl. I will make it quick." Nez rose to a kneeling position, aiming his rifle. "Go back. Silas, the army is coming. Let them come." Silas roared. "They will find 2 dead bodies and a tragic story of a woman killed by her kidnapper." Pike raised his rifle. Nez fired. Pike crumpled, clutching his leg. But in the split second Nez took to shoot Pike, Silas charged. He was faster than he looked. He closed the distance while Nez was working the lever. Nez stood up to meet him, swinging the rifle stock as a club because he had no time to aim. Silas ducked the swing and slammed the barrel of his revolver into Nez's temple. Nez crumbled. He hit the ground, dazed, blood pouring from a cut above his eye. "Nez!" Joanna screamed. She scrambled toward him. Silas grabbed her. He seized her by the hair and the back of her dress. Hauling her up, he spun her around, jamming the cold barrel of the revolver against her temple. "Get up!" Silas shouted at Nez, who was trying to push himself off the ground. "Get up and drop the gun, or I will paint these rocks with her brains." Nez froze on his hands and knees. He looked up, blood streaming down his face. He saw the gun pressed into Joanna's soft skin. He slowly opened his hands, letting his rifle fall to the dust. "Good," Silas panted. His breath smelled of stale whiskey and fear. He tightened his grip on Joanna. His arm was hooked around her neck, pulling her back against his chest. Joanna could feel his heart hammering against her back. He was shaking. "You see," Silas spat, looking down at Nez. "You are nothing, and she—" He laughed, a jagged, hysterical sound. "Look at her, a shield of lard. That is all she is good for, stopping bullets with her fat." He pressed the gun harder against Joanna's head. "No one will miss her. Indian, no one cries for the ugly ones. I will tell the town I tried to save her, but she was too slow, too heavy to get away. They will believe me. They always believe the rich man." Joanna stood there, tears stinging her eyes. The old words, the old shame. Shield of lard. Too slow, too heavy. But then she looked at Nez. Nez was not looking at Silas. He was looking at her. His eyes were locked on hers, intense and pleading. He was not asking her to be quiet. He was not asking her to be small. "I need warm arms," he had said. "I need someone who doesn't disappear." Joanna felt the weight of Silas behind her. He was leaning back slightly, trying to balance her weight against his. He was treating her like a sack of flour. "Dead weight! Dead weight!" Joanna stopped crying. Her breath hitched, then steadied. She was not a sack of flour. She was a mountain. "You are right, Silas," Joanna said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. Silas blinked. "Shut up, cow. I'm heavy," Joanna said. And then she let go. She did not struggle forward. She did not try to pull away. Instead, she went completely limp. She dropped her knees and threw her entire upper body backward with every ounce of force she possessed. It was simple physics. Silas was expecting resistance. He was pulling back, when Joanna threw her 200 pounds backward into him, creating a sudden, massive shift in the center of gravity. He stood no chance. What the? Silas lost his footing. Joanna's weight crushed him backward. He fell hard onto the rocky ground, with Joanna landing squarely on top of him. The air was driven from his lungs in a grunt of agony. Her head slammed back into his nose. There was a sickening crunch. The impact jarred the gun from his hand. It clattered across the stone, skittering away toward the edge of the gorge. Joanna rolled off him immediately, gasping for air. Silas lay in the dirt, clutching his broken nose, blood streaming through his fingers, wheezing for breath. You, he gurgled. Nez was there in an instant. He did not go for his rifle. He grabbed Silas by the lapels of his expensive dusty suit and hauled him up. Look at her, Nez roared. He punched Silas. It was a single, devastating blow to the jaw. It carried all the anger of the burning camps, the stolen water, and the insults hurled at the woman he loved. Silas collapsed like an empty sack. He did not get up. Nez stood over him, chest heaving. He wiped the blood from his own eye. Then he turned to Joanna. She was sitting on the ground, dusting off her skirts. She was bruised, bleeding from a scratch on her cheek, and her hair was a disaster. Nez dropped to his knees in front of her. He did not check the perimeter. He did not look for the gun. He grabbed her face in his hands. Are you hurt? He demanded, his voice rough with panic. I sat on him, Joanna said, a hysterical giggle bubbling up in her throat. I sat on him. Nez. You crushed him, Nez said, a fierce light in his eyes. He pulled her into a crushing embrace, burying his face in her neck. You magnificent woman. You crushed him. The sound of hoofbeats thundered across the bridge. Hold your fire, a commanding voice shouted. Joanna and Nez broke apart. A column of U.S. cavalry had crossed the bridge and was fanning out around them. At their head was a stern-looking man with a gray mustache and the insignia of a lieutenant colonel on his dusty uniform. The soldiers leveled their carbines at Nez. Step away from the white woman, the colonel shouted. Nez slowly raised his hands, but he did not step away. He stood up, placing himself between Joanna and the soldiers, shielding her. I am not hurting her, Nez said calmly. I am the one who called you, Colonel Holloway. Colonel Holloway rode closer, his eyes darting from the unconscious Silas Crowley to the wounded foreman, and finally, to Joanna. Miss Mercer, Holloway asked, looking confused. The report said you were kidnapped, that these savages were holding you for ransom. Joanna struggled to her feet. Her legs were shaking, but she forced them to hold her. She walked forward until she stood next to Nez. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his in plain sight of the entire U.S. Army. There are no savages here, Colonel, Joanna said, her voice ringing clear in the canyon silence. Except the man lying in the dirt over there. She released Nez's hand for a moment and reached into the neckline of her dress. Her hand dove deep into her corset. The soldiers watched, bewildered. Joanna pulled out the folded, crumpled pages. They were warm from her body. They were stained with her sweat and the dust of the fight. She walked up to the colonel's horse and held them up. Silas Crowley hired men to attack your wagons, Joanna said. He hired men to burn the Navajo camps. He hired men to attack me. Here are the names. Here are the dates. And here is how much he paid them to paint their faces. Colonel Holloway took the papers. He adjusted his glasses and read silently. The silence stretched, heavy and profound. He looked at the boot of the unconscious Pike. The star pattern on the heel was clearly visible. He looked back at the ledger pages. Slowly, the colonel's face turned a shade of angry red. He looked at Silas Crowley, who was moaning and trying to sit up. Sergeant Holloway barked, "Sir, arrest that man." Holloway pointed at Silas. "And his foreman, Shackles, I want them secure." "On what charge, sir?" "Treason," Holloway said coldly. "And conspiracy to incite an Indian war." Two soldiers dismounted and hauled Silas to his feet. Silas spat blood, his eyes wild. He saw Joanna standing there, standing tall beside the Navajo warrior. "She is lying," Silas screamed, his voice bubbling with blood. "She is a whore, a fat, stupid whore who sleeps with animals. Look at her. She is disgusting." The insults echoed off the canyon walls. But this time, they sounded thin. They sounded weak. Joanna looked at him. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She felt Nez's hand find the small of her back, a warm, solid presence. "You can call me fat, Silas," Joanna said, her voice calm and devastatingly final. "You can call me whatever you want, but you will have to do it from a prison cell." The colonel nodded to his men. "Take him away. Gag him if he does not shut up." The soldiers dragged Silas toward a wagon. His screams of rage faded as they hauled him off. The colonel looked down at Joanna and Nez. He looked at their joined hands. He was a man of the old world, and his expression was one of disapproval mixed with grudging respect. "Miss Mercer," Holloway said stiffly, "you have done the territory a service, though I must say, your methods are unorthodox." "My methods are heavy, Colonel," Joanna said, a small smile touching her lips. "But they work." Holloway tipped the brim of his hat to her. Then he looked at Nez. He did not salute, but he nodded. It was the acknowledgement of one soldier to another. "We will need statements," Holloway said. "Come to the fort tomorrow. We will be there," Nez said. The soldiers began to organize the transport of the prisoners. The adrenaline was fading, leaving Joanna trembling. Her knees suddenly felt like water. She swayed. Nez caught her immediately. He scooped her up into his arms. "I can walk," Joanna protested weakly, though she leaned into him. "You have walked enough," Nez said. He held her against his chest, unbothered by the dust, the sweat, or her weight. "Today, you fought like a warrior. Now, let me carry you." Joanna rested her head on his shoulder. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the canyon. The danger was over. The truth was out. And for the first time, Joanna Mercer did not feel too heavy. She felt held. The arrest of Silas Crowley did not happen quietly, but the silence that followed it was profound. It was the silence of a fever breaking. The United States Marshals arrived 3 days after the incident at Devil's Backbone to transport Silas and his wounded foreman to the federal territorial prison. The entire town of Red Mesa Crossing turned out to watch. They stood on the wooden boardwalks, shielding their eyes from the glare of the sun, watching the man who had owned half the valley be loaded into a cage wagon like a common cattle thief. Silas did not scream this time. His jaw was wired shut by the regimental surgeon at the fort, a consequence of Nez Greyhawk's single, devastating punch. He sat in the shadows of the wagon, his eyes darting hatefully from face to face. But he found no purchase. The ledger, the damned book of names and numbers, had been published in the Territorial Gazette. Everyone knew. They knew about the costumes. They knew about the paint. They knew that the Navajo terror that had kept them awake at night, clutching their Winchesters, had been purchased for $50 a raid by the man who smiled at them in church. Joanna Mercer watched the wagon roll out of town from the window of her room at the Traveler's Rest. She did not feel triumph. She felt a deep, exhausted relief. Downstairs, the atmosphere in the inn had shifted tectonically. Aunt May was in the parlor, vigorously dusting a collection of porcelain figurines. For days, she had been vibrating with a strange energy. When Joe walked down the stairs, the floorboards creaking under her boots, May stopped. "The butcher saved the best cut of brisket for us today," May said, her voice high and tight. He said a woman who can tackle a gunman needs her strength." Joe paused on the bottom step. "Did he?" May turned. Her eyes were wet. She looked at Joe, really looked at her, taking in the broad shoulders and the solid waist that Joe usually tried to hide behind an apron. "He said you have the Mercer spirit," May said, her voice cracking. "He said you are built like a fortress. I told him yes, she is." It was the first time Aunt May had ever acknowledged Joe's size without a suggestion of a diet or a tighter corset. It was a clumsy offering, but it was genuine. "Thank you, Aunt May," Joe said softly. "Go on." May waved her duster, sniffing loudly. "That boy is waiting for you on the porch, the tall one. Do not keep him waiting. It is rude." The town of Red Mesa Crossing was learning to see with new eyes. As Joe walked down the main street toward the livery stable where Nez was checking on his horse, she felt the change in the air. Before, the looks she received were furtive, laced with pity or mockery. Men would glance at her hips and snicker. Women would look at her waist and look away, thankful for their own hunger. Now, the looks were direct. They were curious. Mrs. Higgins, the banker's wife, a woman who had once publicly suggested Joe should drink vinegar to shrink her stomach, stopped sweeping her porch as Joe passed. "Miss Mercer, Mrs. Higgins called out. Joe braced herself. "Mrs. Higgins, is it true?" the woman asked, leaning on her broom. "Did you really knock Silas Crowley down with your own self?" "I did," Joe said, lifting her chin. "I threw my weight at him. It seemed the practical thing to do." "Mrs." Higgins blinked. She looked at Joe's formidable figure. A slow, respectful smile spread across her face. "Well, Mrs." Higgins said, "I suppose the Lord gives us the tools we need. Good day to you, Joanna." "Good day," Joe replied. She kept walking. She realized with a sudden jolt that her body had not changed. She was still heavy. Her arms were still thick. But the meaning of her body had changed in the eyes of the town. It was no longer a symbol of gluttony or failure. It was a weapon. It was a shield. It was the thing that had broken the tyrant's nose. However, not everyone could face the new reality. As she passed the general store, the door opened and Ethan Doyle stepped out. He was carrying a single, battered suitcase. He wore a traveling coat that looked too large for him, as if he had shrunk in the wash. He froze when he saw Joe. The town knew about Ethan. The colonel's report had mentioned the informant who had leaked the location of the meeting. Ethan had not been arrested. His cowardice was not technically a crime, but he had been convicted in the court of public opinion. The men at the saloon would not pour him a drink. The women turned their backs when he tipped his hat. Ethan looked at Joe. His eyes were red-rimmed and full of a pathetic mixture of resentment and shame. "I suppose you are happy," Ethan sneered. Though his voice lacked any real bite, it was thin and reedy. "I am not happy that you are leaving." "Ethan," Joe said calmly, "I do not care enough about you to be happy or sad. I am just indifferent." "I was only trying to survive," Ethan muttered, shifting his grip on the suitcase. "Silas, he was a powerful man. What was I supposed to do?" "You were supposed to be a man," Joe said. "You were supposed to have a spine, but I suppose that is something you cannot buy in a catalog." Ethan flinched. He looked at her, and for a moment, the old insult rose to his lips. He wanted to call her fat. He wanted to call her a cow, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the woman standing before him, solid, unmoving, grounded like an oak tree, and then he looked at his own reflection in the store window, slight and fading. "Goodbye, Joanna," he whispered. He walked past her, heading toward the train station. He walked with his head down, scurrying like a beetle. Joe watched him go, and felt absolutely nothing. The moth that had fluttered in her chest for him was dead, and she did not miss it. The removal of Silas Crowley opened the floodgates for change. The Army, embarrassed by how easily they had been manipulated by a cattle baron, was eager to restore order and dignity to the territory. Colonel Holloway established a temporary command post at the edge of the canyon. For the first time in 10 years, the soldiers were not pointing guns at the Navajo. They were sitting across a table from them. Nez Greyhawk sat on one side, flanked by 2 elders. The colonel sat on the other, and sitting between them, with a stack of paper and a pot of ink, was Joanna Mercer. She wrote down the boundaries of the grazing lands. She wrote down the guarantees for the water rights in the canyon. She translated the colonel's stiff, formal military English into concepts Nez could relay to the elders, and she translated the poetic, circular logic of the dun into terms the army could stamp and file. "The railroad," Nez said, pointing to the map. It cannot cut through the red echoes. That is where the spirits of the ancestors sleep. If the iron snake goes there, the ground will bleed. The survey suggests it is the most direct route, the colonel argued. Tapping the paper, to move it 2 miles south would cost the company $5,000 in grading. If it goes through the canyon, Nez said calmly, it will cost them a war. The spirits will throw rocks on the tracks, and I will help them. The colonel sighed, rubbing his temples. He looked at Joe. Write it down. Miss Mercer, Holloway said. Recommendation to alter the grade 2 miles south. Citing geological instability. Joe hid a smile as she dipped her pen. Geological instability. Yes, Colonel. Nez caught her eye across the table. His face remained stoic, but his eyes were dancing. He was a warrior who had learned that sometimes. Ink was sharper than a knife. In the weeks that followed, Joe found a new purpose. She realized that the town of Red Mesa Crossing needed something it had never had: a middle ground, a place where the lines between civilized and savage could blur. She took the money she had saved and a surprising, guilt-ridden investment loan from the bank, authorized by Mr. Higgins, and bought a small, dilapidated shack near the new railroad depot, right on the road that led to the Navajo lands. She cleaned it out. She painted it yellow. She put sturdy tables made of pine planks on the porch. She called it the Crossing Kitchen. It was not a delicate tea room. It was a place for hunger. She cooked venison chili with blue cornbread. She made fry bread, a Navajo recipe Azat So had taught her, served with honey and beans. She made steaks thick enough to satisfy a cavalryman. And the people came. Soldiers came because the food was better than their rations. Navajo traders came because they were welcomed at the front door, not the back. Railroad workers came because Joe gave them extra biscuits. Joe stood behind the counter, her face flushed from the stove, her arms covered in flour. She did not hide in the back anymore. She greeted everyone. More coffee, Corporal, she would ask. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, the soldier would say, looking at her with genuine appreciation. Is the fry bread fresh? Ha-ah! A young Navajo rider would ask, using the name Nez had given her. Hot from the oil, she would reply. Her size became part of the establishment's legend. Go to Joe's, people would say. She does not skimp. She knows what a working man needs. Her body, once a source of shame, became a symbol of abundance. In a land of scarcity and dust, Joe was the promise of plenty. One late afternoon, when the rush had died down and the sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Nez came to the kitchen. He tied his horse to the rail and walked up the steps. He was wearing a new shirt, clean calico, but his boots were still dusty from the range. Joe was wiping down a table on the porch. She stopped when she saw him. We are closed, warrior, she teased gently. No more fry bread today. I do not hunger for bread, Nez said. He sat on the railing of the porch, looking out toward the red cliffs that burned in the sunset. Joe abandoned her rag and went to stand beside him. She leaned her hip against the railing, comfortable in the silence. The surveyors moved the stakes today, Nez said. The railroad will go south. The canyon is safe. That is good news, Joe said. She looked at his profile. You did that. You saved it. We did that, Nez corrected. He turned to look at her. I would have just shot them. You made them sign papers. Your way is less messy. Mostly, Joe laughed. Less messy, I seem to recall sitting on a man until his nose broke. That was not very ladylike. Nez grinned, the expression transforming his face. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. When you threw yourself back, it was like a landslide. Silas never had a chance. I was terrified, Joe admitted, looking down at her hands. I thought I wasn't heavy enough. I thought he would just push me away. Joe, Nez said. He reached out and took her hand, pulling her a step closer until she stood between his knees. If you were any lighter, the wind would take you, and I would not like that. He rested his hands on her waist. He did not try to span it. He could not. Instead, he rested his palms on the curve of her hips, grounding her. "They are talking in the town," Joe said quietly, the old fear surfacing like a stone in a plowed field. "They say I am keeping you as a pet, or that you are bewitching me. They say a white woman and a Navajo. It is against nature." "Nature does not care about their words," Nez said. "Look at the sky. Look at the rock. Do they care who walks on them?" "I do not want to be a burden to you, Nez," Joe whispered. "I do not want you to be an outcast because of me. You are a leader now, a diplomat. What will your people say if you bring home a big white woman?" Nez looked at her intensely. "My people say that a man who finds a spring in the desert should build his house next to it. You are my spring. Joe, you are cool water and warm fire." He pulled her closer, pressing his forehead against her stomach. It was a gesture of profound intimacy and submission. "I have spent my life fighting," he murmured into the fabric of her dress. "Sleeping on rocks, cold, hungry, always watching the horizon for enemies. When I hold you, I do not have to watch the horizon. I am warm. I am full." He looked up at her. "You are not a burden. You are home." Joe looked down at him. The tears that pricked her eyes were not tears of pain. They were tears of release. The wall she had built around herself, the wall made of shame and apologies, finally crumbled. "Then stay," she whispered. "Stay here. Be home." That night, Joe sat alone in her room at the back of the kitchen. A small oil lamp cast a golden glow over the simple furniture. She stood before the full-length mirror she had bought from a traveling merchant. For years, mirrors had been her enemy. They were the judges that delivered the verdict of guilty every morning. Slowly, methodically, Joe began to undress. She unbuttoned her dress and let it fall to the floor. She stepped out of her petticoats. Finally, she reached for the laces of her corset. The corset was a stiff, canvas contraption reinforced with whalebone. It was designed to mold, to compress, to force her body into a shape that society deemed acceptable. It left red marks on her skin. It made it hard to digest food. It made it hard to breathe. Joe undid the knots. She pulled the laces loose. With a deep exhale, she pulled the corset open and let it drop. Her body expanded. Her ribs flared as she took a full, deep breath. Her stomach rounded out, soft and pale. Her breasts settled. She stood naked before the mirror. She saw the roll of flesh at her waist. She saw the dimples in her thighs. She saw the thick, strong arms that had kneaded 1,000 loaves of bread and knocked a tyrant into the dirt. "They call you fat," she whispered to her reflection. She reached out and touched the glass, tracing the curve of her own hip. "But you are alive," she said. She thought of the men who had mocked her. Ethan, Silas, the cowboys. They were gone, or broken, or small. She thought of Nez. "I need warm arms." She looked at the reflection and, for the first time, she did not see a mistake. She saw a survivor. She saw a woman who had crossed a desert, fought a war, and won a peace. "Thank you," she said to her body. "Thank you for carrying me." She blew out the lamp. She climbed into her bed, stretching her limbs out to all 4 corners. She took up space. She took up all the space she needed, and she did not apologize to the dark. The next morning, the sun rose over Red Mesa Crossing with a brilliance that promised a scorching day. Joanna Mercer stepped out onto the porch of the crossing kitchen. She was wearing a new dress. It was made of yellow cotton, bright as a sunflower. She had not put on her corset. The dress was tailored to fit her, not to squeeze her. It flowed over her hips. It held her bosom gently. The sash at her waist was tied loosely. She felt the morning air on her skin through the fabric. She felt soft. She felt free. Nez was already there, watering his horse at the trough. He looked up as she stepped out. His eyes widened. He took in the yellow dress, the looseness of her stance, the way she was breathing deeply and easily. He dropped the bucket. He walked over to the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Yellow," he said, like the pollen of the corn. Do I look messy? Jo asked, a playful light in her eyes. You look dangerous, Nez said, a slow smile spreading across his face, like a woman who has stopped fighting herself and is ready to take on the world. The world can wait, Jo said, stepping down to meet him. Breakfast is ready. And I made extra. Nez laughed, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls and startled the crows into flight. He offered her his arm, not to support her, but to walk with her. Lead the way, ha-ah-ah, he said. They walked into the kitchen together, the door closing behind them, shutting out the dust and the past, leaving only the warmth of the fire and the promise of the future. The falling action was over. The resolution was all that remained. The autumn of 1890 arrived in the Arizona Territory not with a chill, but with a softening of the light. The harsh, bleaching white sun of summer mellowed into a rich, golden haze that turned the red sandstone cliffs into walls of fire at sunset. The air grew crisp, smelling of pine resin drifting down from the high peaks and the smoke of cedar fires. It was on one such afternoon, when the shadows were beginning to stretch long and purple across the valley floor, that Joanna Mercer and Nez Greyhawk stood on a limestone ridge overlooking Red Mesa Crossing. There was no church steeple above them, only the vast, vaulted dome of the western sky, an expanse of blue so deep it looked like painted porcelain. There was no white lace dress imported from St. Louis. Joanna wore a dress of deep indigo wool, sturdy and practical, cut to allow her to breathe, to move, to live. Around her waist, she wore a sash of woven red wool, a gift from Asa Tso. She did not look like a delicate flower. She looked like the river that carved the canyon, powerful, deep, and undeniable. Nez stood beside her. He wore his finest buckskins, the leather soft as velvet, and a clean white shirt that contrasted sharply with his dark, wind-weathered skin. His hair was freshly braided, tied with strips of red cloth to match her sash. They were not alone, but the crowd was small. Aunt May stood to the left, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief that was already soaked. Beside her stood Colonel Holloway, stiff and formal in his dress uniform, a silent testament to the strange peace Joanna had brokered. On the right stood a circle of Navajo elders, wrapped in their blankets, their faces like carved wood. Two men stood before the couple. One was Reverend Miller, a young, nervous man from the town who kept adjusting his spectacles. The other was Hastian Yazi, the singer for the local Dine clan. Two worlds, two languages, standing on one rock. The ceremony was not long. There were no sermons about obeying or serving. Hastian Yazi spoke first, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. He spoke of the Earth Mother and the Sky Father, of the balance between the rain and the corn. He waved a fan of eagle feathers over them, scattering yellow corn pollen, the dust of life, onto their shoulders. Then Reverend Miller spoke. He read from the Book of Ruth, his voice thin in the wind but steady. Where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. It was time for the exchange. Joanna reached into the pocket of her dress. Her hands, steady and strong, pulled out a square of white cotton. She had spent the last 3 nights working on it by lamplight. It was a handkerchief, hemmed with blue thread. In the center, she had embroidered a simple image, 2 red mountain peaks, and beneath them, 2 pairs of arms, one thick and pale, one lean and copper interlaced like the roots of an ancient tree. She placed it in Nez's hand. I cannot give you gold, Joanna said, her voice clear enough to be heard over the wind. I can only give you my work. This is a promise that I will always keep your brow cool, and that my hands will always be ready to hold yours. Nez looked at the cloth. He ran his thumb over the embroidery, tracing the shape of the arms. He tucked it carefully into his shirt, against his heart. Then, he reached into a small leather pouch at his belt. He pulled out a necklace. It was heavy, made of solid silver hammered into the shape of squash blossoms, each one set with a stone of brilliant turquoise. The blue stones were veined with black matrix, the map of the earth inside the color of the sky. He stepped forward and fastened it around Joanna's neck. The silver was cool against her warm skin, a weight that felt like an anchor. "Turquoise is the stone of the sky and the water," Nez said. "It is what keeps the dry land alive. You are the water in my desert. Joe, without you, the corn does not grow. Without you, the warrior has no home to return to." He took her hands. His grip was firm, calloused palm against calloused palm. "I make this vow to you," Nez said, looking directly into her eyes. "I cannot stop the wind from blowing. I cannot stop the snow from falling. And I cannot stop the tongues of small-minded people from wagging. They will whisper. They will stare. I cannot promise to silence the world for you." He paused, a fierce light entering his eyes. "But I promise you this: when they whisper, I will stand beside you. When they stare, I will hold you closer. I will not protect you from the truth of who we are. I will celebrate it. We will laugh at them. Joe, we will laugh because we are warm, and they are cold." Joanna felt a lump form in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She did not want to cry. She wanted to speak. "And I make this vow to you," Joanna replied. She stepped closer, invading his space, her body pressing against the air between them until it vanished. "For my whole life, I have apologized. I apologized for taking up room on the bench. I apologized for the size of my shadow. I apologized for existing." She squeezed his hands. "I am done apologizing. I take this space beside you. Nez Greyhawk, I claim it. I promise that I will never shrink myself to fit into a smaller life. I will fill this house. I will fill your arms, and I will fill this life until it overflows. I am here, all of me. All of you," Nez whispered. The Reverend cleared his throat. "I pronounce you united." There was no polite applause. Instead, the Navajo elders began a low, rhythmic chant, a song of blessing. Colonel Holloway tipped his hat. Aunt May sobbed openly, a sound of pure joy. And on the ridge, under the vast American sky, Nez and Joanna did not wait for permission. They leaned in and sealed their promise with a kiss that tasted of sagebrush and forever. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the guests began to drift away. The colonel had to return to the fort for the evening roll call. The elders had a long ride back to the winter camp. Aunt May went back to the inn to prepare the wedding supper. Eventually, only 2 figures remained on the ridge. The twilight was deepening into a rich, velvety purple. The first star, the evening star, burned white and lonely in the west. Nez turned to Joanna. The ceremony was over. The words were said. Now, there was only the reality of the two of them in the quiet dark. He reached out and pulled her to him. It was not a tentative embrace. He wrapped his arms around her fully, his hands splaying across the broad expanse of her back. He pulled her in until there was no daylight between them. For a fleeting second, the old reflex twitched in Joanna's mind, the instinct to suck in her stomach, to make herself rigid, to minimize the contact. But the weight of the silver necklace on her chest reminded her of her vow. "I am done apologizing." She let her breath out in a long sigh. She softened. She allowed her body to yield against his. She felt the hardness of his chest, the lean strength of his thighs, and the way his arms encompassed her. She was a big woman. She was heavy, and yet, in his arms, she did not feel like a burden. She felt like a puzzle piece that had finally found its matching edge. He did not struggle to hold her. He held her as if she were the very foundation of his world. "You are warm," Nez murmured into her hair. "I am a furnace." Joe chuckled softly, her vibration traveling into his chest. "Good," he said. "The nights are getting cold." He pulled back slightly, just enough to look at her face. The last light of the day caught the curve of her cheek and the fullness of her lips. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb. "I love you, Joe," he said. "Not despite of anything, because of everything." He kissed her again. This time, it was not for the show. It was a slow, deep exploration. It was a kiss that acknowledged every scar, every stretch mark, every battle they had fought to stand on this rock. It was a kiss of profound acceptance. Joanna closed her eyes and felt the last brick of her fortress crumble, leaving her open, safe, and entirely free. Winter came and went, white snow dusting the red rocks, followed by the explosion of wildflowers in the spring. The small shack near the railroad depot, once a yellow-painted gamble, had transformed. It was now simply known as the Crossing. It was a place that defied the unwritten laws of the territory. Inside, the air was always thick with the smell of roasting coffee, frying bacon, and the earthy scent of corn stew. The tables were long communal planks where a unearth cavalry sergeant might find himself sitting next to a Navajo sheep herder. On a Tuesday morning in April, the place was bustling. Joanna moved through the room like a ship under full sail. She carried a tray with 4 plates of steak and eggs on one arm and a pot of coffee in the other hand. She moved with confidence, her hips swaying, her laughter ringing out over the clatter of silverware. She set the plates down in front of a table of railroad engineers. "Eat up, boys," she commanded. "You have 10 miles of track to lay today. I do not want anyone fainting." "Yes, ma'am," the foreman said, grinning. "Best food west of the Mississippi." Joe, in the corner of the room, near the large stone fireplace Nez had built with his own hands, was a large slate blackboard. 3 children sat on a rug before it. One was a little girl with blonde braids, the daughter of the station master. 2 were Navajo boys, their hair tied back in traditional buns. They were copying letters onto small slate tiles. A, P, P, L, E. Joanna paused in her rounds to check on them. She wiped her hands on her apron and leaned down. "That is a very good A. Thomas," she said to one of the Navajo boys, "but your P is leaning a little, like it is tired." The boy giggled. "It is sleeping." "Ha. Well, wake it up," she teased gently, ruffling his hair. This was her family. She and Nez had no children of their own, yet perhaps they never would. Perhaps they would, but she had become the mother of the Crossing. She fed the hungry, she taught the ignorant, and she offered a neutral ground where the only war was against an empty stomach. Of course, the world had not become a paradise overnight. A bell jingled as the front door opened. A stranger walked in, a traveler off the morning train, dressed in a dusty suit, looking tired and irritable. He looked around the room, his lip curling as he saw the mix of races. He sat at an empty table. When Joe approached him with the coffee pot, he looked her up and down with a familiar, sneering expression. "I will take coffee," he said rudely. "And tell me, is there a cook in the back who takes up less room than you, or is the kitchen crowded?" The room went quiet. The railroad foreman stopped chewing. The Navajo boys looked up. Joanna did not flinch. She did not blush. She poured the coffee into his mug, filling it perfectly to the brim without spilling a drop. "The kitchen is just the right size." "Mister," Joe said calmly. "And so am I." Before the man could respond, the sergeant at the next table stood up. He was a man who had been at Devil's Backbone. "You might want to watch your tongue, stranger," the sergeant said, his hand resting casually on his belt. "That lady is the one who saved this damn town. She has more grit in her little finger than you have in your whole suit. And she makes better stew than your mother," a Navajo trader added from across the room. The stranger looked around. He saw a room full of hard men, white, red, and brown, all looking at him with cold eyes. He saw that he was the one who did not fit. He swallowed hard. Just the coffee, ma'am. Thank you." Joanna smiled at the sergeant, a genuine, warm expression. The world had changed. She had changed it, simply by refusing to move. That evening, the air was soft and fragrant. Nez and Joanna walked out to the small grove of juniper trees behind their house. The house itself had grown. Nez had added a new room, and they had planted a garden of squash and beans that was thriving in the desert soil. Nez stopped by a young juniper tree. He took out his knife. "I was thinking," he said, turning the blade in the moonlight. "I should mark this tree, in the old way, to show that this land is occupied by a family." He began to carve a symbol into the bark, a simple shape representing a hogan and a flame. He looked at Joe. "Do you want me to carve your name or JM? So they know you are here too." Joanna looked at the tree. She looked at the sturdy house with the smoke curling from the chimney. She looked at the man who stood before her, his hair silvering slightly at the temples now, but his eyes as fierce and loving as ever. She smiled and shook her head. "No," she said. "The tree will grow. The bark will stretch and cover the letters. It is just wood." She stepped forward and placed her hand over his heart, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat beneath the buckskin. "My name is written here," she said. "That is the only place it matters. And this—" She gestured to her own body, to the width of her hips and the strength of her arms. "This is my monument. I am still here. I survived the winter. I survived the whispers. I am standing—" Nez covered her hand with his. "You are not just standing, Joe. You are blooming." The story of Joanna Mercer and Nez Greyhawk was not written in the history books of the territory. It was not recorded in the official military logs, other than a few dry footnotes about a land dispute settlement. But stories in the West have a way of traveling on the wind. Around campfires, cowboys would tell the tale of the Iron Lady who crushed a tyrant with nothing but her own weight. In the Hogans, grandmothers would tell their granddaughters about the Woman of the Sunrise, the white woman who had a heart big enough to hold the Navajo people. They became a legend, not of gunfights or gold, but of something rarer. The narrator's voice drifted over the scene, carrying the weight of a century of storytelling. The body is not an apology to the world. It is a map of the battles we have fought, the hunger we have survived, and the love we have dared to hold. True love does not require a standard form. It requires a heart vast enough to encompass the scars of two people. Freedom in the West was never just about the open range or the endless sky. True freedom is the refusal to bow. It is the courage to inhabit one's own skin, to take up space without asking for permission, and to love without fear. The final image was one of stillness and vastness. Joanna and Nez stood once again on the high ridge overlooking the valley. It was night now. The Milky Way was a river of diamond dust spilled across the black velvet of the sky. Below them, far in the distance, the headlight of a train cut through the darkness, a small, moving star of industry. The world was changing. The Old West was fading, being replaced by steel and steam. But on the ridge, the ancient things remained. Joanna leaned back against Nez's chest. His arms were wrapped around her, his chin resting on the top of her head. She held his forearms, feeling the strength of him supporting her. She felt warm. She felt solid. She felt entirely complete. Nez tightened his grip, pulling her even closer, as if trying to merge their shadows into one. He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated against her back. "Good thing you are not a tiny waist," he whispered into the vast silence of the desert night. "I would hate to have less of you to hold." Joanna laughed, a free, joyous sound that rose up to meet the stars. "You will never have less of me, Nez," she promised. "Always more, always all." The wind whispered through the sagebrush. The stars burned on, indifferent to kings and railroads, shining only on the truth of two people who had found their own way home. The end. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope Joanna and Nez's journey touched your heart and reminded you that you are worthy of love and space, exactly as you are. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below telling me which country or city you are tuning in from. It is amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to my channel, Wild West Tales. Do not forget to hit the like button and smash that hype button to help this story reach more people. Your support means the world to me and helps me keep bringing these stories to life. Stay wild and see you in the next adventure.